Thank you for participating in Mass Timber March Madness. Excited to have Will Novy-Hildesley here to speak on mass timber and climate change and media, the climate, the planet, and social media. I think Will's going to cover a lot of topics. Really looking forward to this. Will, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. You gave me the world to cover there in one sentence. So we'll see how far we can get in our 60 minutes here, but welcome everybody and thanks for joining. Sorry, we're not doing this in person, but excited to be able to reach so many people and have this conversation today. And I do want to thank, I know we're thanking the Forest Service, all the sponsors of this, but I particularly want to thank Greg for over the past couple of years being one of the key people I've spoken to about mass timber, climate change, this community. And as I'm sure all of you know, Greg will always pick up the phone anytime, day or night, also weekends, it turns out, and chat stuff through. So thank you, Greg, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. So my name's Will Novy-Hildesley. I spent the last 4 years running something called Forest Proud, #ForestProud, which I hope most of you have seen or had a chance to see the content from. But that's definitely part of the story of how I got to today. And Forest Proud was a community of over 100 organizations in the US that spanned everything from the Forest Service to lumber companies, landowners, mass timber producers, nonprofits, all of whom were essentially trying to tell the story of the forest sector and reframe the public's perception of the forest sector as a solution to problems instead of a problem in and of itself. So I'm going to start my presentation here. I'll check with Greg if we're working, and also take questions as we go. So feel free to throw questions my way. We'll save time certainly for questions at the end, but I also happy to make this more conversational if we can. So I moved on from Forest Proud, started this year to launch something called MASS, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what MASS is today, but essentially it's a community and it hopefully involves all of you. But whenever I introduced Forest Proud to people, I think even 3 years ago, certainly perhaps not in the first year, we always started with this slide. And I want to tell you the story of this slide and maybe tell it in 2 different versions. So I know we've probably got structural engineers and scientists on this call, but I want you to sit tight for a story if you can, because I think storytelling is incredibly important to the future of this community and to helping mass timber have the impact it can have on climate change and all sorts of other challenges we face today. But the story I used to tell about this slide is, here's this woman. She's working in a beautiful mass timber office. And she absentmindedly sort of stroking the wall as she walks past. And then she goes and sits in a wooden chair at a wooden desk, picks up a wooden pencil and a piece of paper, and writes a letter to her local politician decrying the fact that she's been driving past lots of trees being cut down, right? So we have this massive disconnect between what we use these products for, how they're produced, and the understanding of sustainable management of forests going forward. And that's really, I think, one of the biggest challenges we have with the adoption curve of mass timber is making sure that the public have the right perception of what we're trying to do here. So what we want to tell is a different story, version 2 of this story. How do we get to the place where in 2030, this woman is walking across her mass timber office, sitting down, writing a letter to her local politician, celebrating the impact that mass timber is having on climate change, looking out from her window across a city where you're seeing more and more adoption of mass timber technology, and that the public really supports these developments and really understands what an incredible opportunity mass timber provides in terms of impacting climate change. And that's what I want to talk about today and hear your questions about. But MASS is specifically a response to working for 4 years with Forest Proud and seeing what happens when you tell the story of mass timber projects. So Forest Proud put out content on social media primarily, really engaging, compelling stories about people in the sector, about the sector itself. And what we learned very quickly, it started as a hunch, but became really clear, was that stories about mass timber projects or mass timber, the community, professionals in this community, were about 4 or 5 times more engaging than any other stories we were trying to tell. When you target 18 to 35-year-olds and you're trying to get them excited about wood products, the forest sector, reimagining cities, the future and how mass timber or timber can play a role in their lives, mass timber stories are just way more engaging than anything else we try to put out there. And learning that became very clear to me that if we're going to reframe the sector as a whole and have people really make this stronger connection between forest products and climate change, and we're really going to see the full potential explored in terms of connecting those two things, that mass timber was the best way to tell that story. So I really started from there. And the goal of mass is simple to say, hard to execute. How do we double the impact that mass timber can have on climate change in half the time we have available? I think most people here have probably attended a number of conferences where we've sort of mapped out the future of mass timber, that adoption curve, seen how quickly we think we can have that impact, how quickly we can get these buildings to be more ubiquitous across the world. And we have this timeline, 2030. How do we get to 2030 and have the kind of impact on climate change that we want? And when you model all of that, we're doubling these buildings every year or whatever it might be. It still doesn't get us there quickly enough. So my goal and the goal of this community is to see how we can get there that much more quickly, and what are the dynamics that we need to address, the barriers we need to address to adoption. And that's what we're going to talk about today a bit. What do we see as the key barriers to impacting climate change with mass timber and accelerating that adoption curve overall? So Mass's mission is to unlock mass timber's potential to address climate change. And we're really trying to do that in 3 ways. And this conversation is very embryonic and informed by everybody I can speak to in this community. And I'm happy to speak to any of you as we zero in on the right way to do this. But 3 key strategies. Build a community globally. I think most of us would agree that operating just in single countries is pretty ridiculous when the market is global. And certainly emerging young leaders in this community think globally. So there's every possibility of connecting people in online platforms as a community, building social ties, and really acting as a community globally rather than taking things on one country at a time or one project at a time. In terms of strategy, we want to distill the key insights that people are learning, whether it's at the project scale, the city scale, or regionally or at a country scale, and then turn those insights into open source templates. We'll talk more about how we're going to try and do that. And then the media piece. How do we build public trust with engaging content in mass timber as a solution and make that incredibly important link in the public mind between sustainable forestry management and these technologies? So simple agenda, hard to implement, half the time, twice the impact. There are 4 dynamics that we've identified, and this is a good point. Well, we'll check in on questions too, that provide the context for, I think, are the key dynamics that are creating barriers to adoption and carbon optimization within the sector. The first, and I think this is where we as a community spend a lot of time right now, and many of you are addressing these challenges. Ian talked a lot about some of the key technical challenges yesterday with the tallwood, sort of business risks and technical challenges. We're early in this wave of mass timber, so there's a lot of technical challenges remaining. But my sense is over time, the market will largely take care of these with the support of all the people who've been funding that over the last few years. Public trust, the forest sector is seen as a problem, not a solution for the most part. And I think many of us working in the sector have a hard time, believing that's still the case or swallowing that news. But certainly a couple of years ago, if you just look at the United States, for example, 80% of people we surveyed at Forest Proud still believe that deforestation is a major problem in the US, and have all sorts of misconceptions about how forests are managed, how forest products are used. So we still have a long way to go to build public trust in the sector. And I think mass timber provides the single best opportunity we have. It's the best story we have to do that. But we also know already with mass timber that amazingly, people are much quicker to question a tall building made out of wood than they are the next one made out of concrete or steel. The industry is conservative and for good reason. 4 years working at Forest Proud taught me a lot about understanding the all the different components of this industry and this sector. So I certainly understand way better than I did 4 years ago why it's a conservative industry. But carbon markets are new. In some cases, they represent regulatory risk for folks. And certainly new technologies represent, risky investments for folks too. So we all know that people are making investments in a sense with associated risk. And finally, opposition. So whether it's from traditional construction, concrete and steel, or sort of the more extreme NGOs who oppose potentially any kind of forest use, we certainly have voices out there already that are going to oppose mass timber construction. Given those barriers, those dynamics that create barriers, I think there are 3 genuine levers that exist to optimize mass timber for climate change benefits. Everybody on this call, everybody in this community, I think, is excited about the climate change potential, the potential benefits of mass timber. They're excited about linking sustainable forestry management and these technologies and these products. But not everybody is positioned to invest in optimizing for those benefits. So how do we look at that? The first, and we'll talk about each of these in a second, is we have big tech and big enterprise companies' carbon goals. And I'm going to go through each of these in more detail in a sec, come back to that one. The second is that we now have within the community, certainly in the States and in Europe, a number of emerging foundations and philanthropic organizations who are both exploring and really want to invest in the climate change potential of these mass timber technologies. So there's new money coming to the table, and that's important money because it can invest in high risk, new types of research, innovation. It's the kind of money that we can spend that's hard to obtain anywhere else. And then, to me, this is perhaps the most exciting part of setting up MASS, is this emerging global community of dynamic, diverse, highly motivated young leaders. I'm helping the Forest Business Network with their conference, hosting that. And in the past couple of months, we've had multiple phone calls with just an extraordinary global new community, I would say newish community of diverse young leaders. And I think they bring incredible energy to the table. And they also bring a new face to this sector and an opportunity to introduce the sector again to this kind of 18 to 35-year-old demographic in a way that's really new and exciting for them. So we have the barriers, and then I think these are the 3 key levers we have to optimize for climate change in this community. And let's deal with the big one. And I think we've probably got people from a lot of different countries here. Here in the States, I think at this point, most of us are starting to hear pretty consistently about big tech companies, big enterprise companies, and their carbon goals. But it's really quite hard to wrap your heads around the scale of the commitments they're making. And in a sense, and I heard this phrase for the first time last week, that there's now sort of carbon competitiveness. It's that they're almost competing over who can have the best story to tell on carbon. And they are, in a sense, they're competing for having a great narrative about their company and the impact they're having on climate change. And the pressure that they're feeling, I think most of us who are talking to any of them in the last couple of years have just seen this unbelievable rapid acceleration in not just making claims about carbon and climate change, but really committing in all sorts of really deep ways to impacting climate change and doing it quickly. And not just climate change, also social issues. So I'll cover a couple of those. But we were talking to Microsoft last week. They're building their new campus down in California. I think it's 17 buildings. It's about 3 million square feet, I think, once they're done. And they're actually not just looking at the carbon impact of the mass timber technology they're going to use, but going all the way through the supply chain. Every single vendor that supplies anything to that building site, they're looking at mitigating the carbon impact of those. So they want to be carbon neutral by 2030 at Microsoft, I believe it is. By 2050, they want to have taken care of all the carbon that mitigated for all the carbon that the company has ever used in its entire history. Those are the type of goals, those are the type of figures that start to make you realize how much potential there is to leverage climate change goals and improve forest management as these companies are making these kind of commitments. Google, we heard on a call the other day, is investing a fund of $1 billion in affordable housing around their new campuses. So these are, truly extraordinary numbers. My sense is, talking to colleagues in the sector, that there's really never been in the history of the forest sector and the history of wooden building technology, a moment where so many resources have been brought to bear in a way that can really influence both the public's perception of this and the opportunity to use wood in ways that impact climate change. This is a one-time opportunity. It's happening very fast. The pressure on these companies is extraordinary. And what it creates for all of us is the opportunity to accelerate that adoption curve, but do it in an incredibly responsible way. So mass has those three key things we're going to try and do. And I don't want to make this all about mass. I want to have a discussion with you about what we want to talk about climate change. But I do want to lay this out for you because I want as many of you to be involved as possible. The first is we're going to build that community, and we want to identify younger leaders who we believe mass could give fellowships to work on these key challenges like climate change or other social issues, and basically create a kind of skunk works or an accelerator where we would pull together young global leaders, definitely global, not just in the States, identify projects and put them and have them identify the projects they want to work on, and then sort of put them into this skunk works where they have project teams and project outcomes. And then from that to distill out key insights, best practices, and create templates for those that we can make open source. Now, I really want to emphasize, listening to Ian yesterday, talking to all sorts of people in the community, there are many, many different platforms that are doing some version of this right now. We're not trying to compete with them. What we do want to do is create the simplest possible publications and sharing of those lessons that are coming out from all those different folks. So not really about duplicating effort that's going on already, but really making sure that we're distilling those lessons and sharing them in very simple ways. I think, listening to those enterprise leaders, talking with people at Microsoft, Google, wherever they might be, at the end of the day, these, they're the first through the wall, right? They're the people who have the resources and can actually, break through that wall of adapting and using these technologies. But if we're actually going to get this to scale, we've got to make it doable for much smaller enterprises as well. Local schools, hospital systems, those kind of things. And I like to tell the story of meeting with my daughter's principal at her high school here in the States. They're rebuilding. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And, Portland's sort of an epicenter for mass timber. And they're rebuilding a high school here that has a couple of thousand students in it. And I said to her, ahead of the construction project, have you considered building this high school in mass timber? And she looked back at me directly and said, yes. too expensive, too complicated, and too controversial. So what we know is right now we're missing these opportunities to really scale this technology because of the kind of barriers that we're talking about. And I know everybody on this call is helping address those. But at the end of the day, if we don't make it simple enough and we don't provide folks like that with the templates that they need to employ this really readily, I don't think we're going to see the adoption curve accelerate to the level that we should. So create a community, drop them into this accelerator. Then distill key insights in what I think of as open source templates. And again, there's partners across the globe who are doing this. We want to partner with all of them and distill the simplest possible versions of that. The way I think about this, and I'm not an architect and no expert in these technologies, but once I started hearing people talk about a BIM and understanding what that was, I think we've got two parallels to that BIM that we need. We need the carbon version of that. And again, lots of really interesting folks working on that. And we also need the public engagement version of that. So if you see on this slide, the sort of construction happening in the middle and the BIM that takes care of that above that, what I'm looking forward to is the time where we have all of these parallel tracks happening together. So when you have a project and you have your BIM for it, and then it's under construction, you have the carbon kind of blueprint happening as well. But we also have a public engagement track happening in parallel with that. So finally, media, and I'm going to share with you a Forest Proud video that we made about Michael Green in a second here. As I said at the opening of this, I spent 4 years really looking at how do you communicate this sector to folks. Not so much globally, although Forest Proud has been picked up in other countries, and there's similar efforts going on in Europe and Australia, for example. But it's a challenge. The forest sector is not, for all sorts of good reasons, highly likely to invest in communicating to the public. And there's really very limited resources to do that. That said, I think these big enterprise companies heavily invested in mass timber are going to understand very well that they have to look after their brand reputation. They have to have a great story to tell about carbon and climate change. And that if they're going to use these products, they need to build public trust in these technologies. So to me, there's a huge win-win here for everybody in the forest sector, which is that we don't have to pool all the resources and come together to only then have very limited money to spend on communications when we have more than $8 trillion worth of companies that are now investing or committing and using mass timber. They should be helping support us to tell that story. With Forest Proud, we were reaching 10 to 15 million people a month on social media with these kind of stories. That was great. That was pre-COVID. It was more like 5 to 8 million probably during that time. And I think we use social media very effectively, cost effectively. Forest Proud's, proud to be part of that. They're going forward, and they're going to do an incredible job of telling that story. But we're also talking to Forest Proud and now to some of those enterprise companies about the idea of trying to do a streaming series that covers this, that talks about reimagining cities, that talks about mass timber. And in my mind, that's the scale at which we need to start telling this story. If we're going to get people globally excited about mass timber and make sure that the public trust is supporting these projects and our efforts and not actually coming out in opposition to them, the scale I want to reach them at is, on Amazon, on Netflix, with a series that tells the story of these technologies, tells the stories of our community, and profiles these new emerging young leaders. I'll show you the video we made at Forest Proud of Michael Green. We did one with Susan Jones. We did one with the Frez brothers. Every one of those films proves to be way more engaging than much of the other content that we made at Forest Proud. And in my mind, I can't think of a more exciting documentary series, I'm clearly biased, that looks at and profiles sort of young emerging leaders across the globe, the kind of buildings that we're all looking at. Visually, it's such a stunning topic, such a great story that we have to tell. And what we know is that it provides this really unique opportunity to reframe the sector and reframe the use of wood buildings in people's minds. We could do all sorts of market research and try and better understand why that is, but I'm pretty sure everyone on this call has experienced this. When whatever you might have told people, or whatever their understanding of the forest sector is and their understanding of wood products is, if you walk them through one of these buildings, or you show them pictures of the new Swatch HQ, you take them through Side Yard here in Portland, it doesn't matter what the project is. If someone hasn't seen a mass timber building before, and you either show them one or you walk them through it, it's an opening. It's a completely different opportunity to look at the connection between sustainable forestry, using wood products, and these buildings that we have. So I'm going to show you the Michael Green video, and then we'll take questions. But that's the note I really want to end on. I think we have an unbelievable opportunity to build public trust and support for these technologies, but we have to invest in that. And that costs money, it takes dedication, it takes time. Making these kind of films is a long-term project. And we as a community need to come together and help make that happen. I'm not sure we ourselves need to pay for that to happen, but I want to work with all of you to make sure that we actually get the public as excited about this as we can. That to me is going to be a key part of halving the time it takes to double our impact on climate change. So let's listen from Michael, and then I'll shut up and take questions, which I hope Greg is amassing too.
I've always looked at this idea that mankind will never, ever compete with nature and will never be able to catch up to Mother Nature's level of innovation as an inspiring way to think about the work I do. I think we have to respect the fact that we have this sort of existential crisis of climate change, this crisis of growth, of need for resources around the world with population urbanizing, and the fact that we need to build a new New York City every month for the next 40 years. About 2.5 trillion square feet of buildings need to be built by 2060. That really comes down to the profound need to make a radical shift in our city building as quickly as possible towards materials that store carbon, and that means wood. You're hard-pressed to meet anybody on the planet that doesn't somehow connect with a natural material like wood and feel like it's special. It gives a warmth to the built environment that people love. That said, there's a whole bunch of other reasons I love it. It's the land of opportunity from an innovation point of view, because we're working with new products that have never been used before, and it means as an architect we can start to shape new spaces and environments that people have not imagined. But for me, it always comes back to the fact that when it comes to choosing a product that has a strong environmental story behind it and a strong climate story behind it, wood is always going to be my first choice. I often say the hardest part of my job is not the engineering and the architectural side of what we do, it's changing the public's perception of what is possible. When we started out with what's now called the tall wood building movement, just 6, 7, 8 years ago, people thought this was a crazy idea that would never happen. And now building codes all over the world are changing to allow these buildings to happen. Architects all over the world are allowing this to happen. Architecture schools are teaching this. And the industry globally has changed really in a very short amount of time to embrace this idea. We've done studies to show that we could have built the Empire State Building entirely using these engineered wood products. Empire State Building is 102 stories tall, and technically we could have built it that way with these products. So they have amazing capacity, but connecting to the public to help them understand the capacity of material, that it actually will be the city building material of the future, is something that it takes some time, and it's about education, it's about connecting and really inspiring a generation of young people to want to seek out, move into these buildings and champion them for their own future. And that means the city of the future, when we look up at the skyline, it'll be built of natural materials and these amazing engineered wood products. I spend a lot of time in cities. I spend an equal amount of time in forests. And I think that the idea of Forest Proud to me is really about quietly listening to the forest for the answers for our future.
Okay, thanks everybody. I hope we can start discussion. Greg, over to you. Do I need to stop sharing my screen or we just leave that up for now?
You can leave it up either way. I think it's just audio at this point.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that. And thank you for all you've already achieved in telling the story and reaching millions of people. That's the heavy lifting, I think, that needs to be done. I'll read off the first question to you. It's from Matthew Chiles. It's building public trust seems to be the biggest barrier to adoption of mass timber structures. I would argue make their biggest impression when physically interacting and experiencing them. With the COVID-19 pandemic impacting our ability to mobilize the public to experience these structures, what are some marketing hurdles that you have encountered and how have you overcome them in the time of COVID?
Yeah, it's a great question. The biggest marketing hurdle overall, just to be completely candid, is this sector, and by this sector, I would define that as the forest sector rather than everybody in this sort of new emerging community, just doesn't have a huge amount of resources to invest in reaching the public. And, you know, I think there's various reasons for that, but the scale of communications we need, we've got to raise, you know, serious money and get on those platforms if we're actually going to reach the public at a scaled way. You know, I think COVID, it's a mixed bag because in some ways people are desperate for great content. And I think most of us have probably watched, you know, everything we could possibly watch on Amazon and Netflix at this point. I think it's a great time to make that kind of content. It is also challenging to shoot that kind of content right now. So that's another challenge. Certainly what I agree with you is I don't think we've yet really seen the scale of this problem. As we accelerate adoption of this technology and as these larger scale projects come into play, you know, if you look at what Walmart's building, for example, that's going to house 17,000 people in their new office campus. I think the public reaction is going to need a lot more management than it currently has, right? So it's only just starting to hit the radar. Certainly here in the States, if you look at last year, the amount of articles that came out on mass timber, you know, all of a sudden we were in Outside Magazine, we're in the New York Post, we're on Bloomberg. There were a number of articles, but people aren't yet really seeing the buildings go up at the scale that they're going to. And my fear is if we don't take care of that public trust issue ahead of that accelerated adoption curve, that's when we're really going to hit problems. And the other problem we have is that there is opposition out there, and there are, you know, major campaigns from concrete and steel, for example, that are ready to, excuse the pun, but literally fan the flames on you know, how mass timber plays out. So we have opposing voices to take care of. We have a massive opportunity to frame and, you know, frame mass timber as a positive and reframe the public's perception of the forest sector. But if we don't do it now, I think it's going to become a much bigger problem once we accelerate the technology. I think, you know, COVID, now we're in an interesting time with COVID, so it's going to be interesting to see how it impacts the market overall. But I think we've got great stories to tell about mass timber in the context of COVID, and not just COVID, in the context of climate change, in the context of affordable housing, and really how we reimagine cities as a whole.
And I wanted to actually have you dive a little deeper. I have a question regarding community and sharing media and resources on an online, ongoing basis, so people can be an active part of a community. There are a lot of events happening around mass timber. I think there's probably more than one per month now, but generally those only can attract a few hundred or a few thousand people. But what about on an ongoing basis? How do you build a community and how do you connect it?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting time because there's a lot of communities being established under a lot of different banners right now. And as I said in the call, and I'm trying to speak to all of them to understand what's the role that mass could play so that we're not duplicating all of that effort, but finding the right slot for the role that we can play. I mean, I think it's interesting just to look at how these conversations now go and talking to folks, how strongly that community is emerging. What I get excited about when I've been on those various conferences is, you know, people are starting to act as a global community, which I think is pretty cool, and they are sharing lessons in that way. But, you know, I think the challenge is to make sure that we're creating, you know, rich connections as a community when we can't all be together. And I think people are getting better and better at doing that. But also making sure we don't become this kind of insular community of mass timber geeks, right? We've got a really big job to do to get the public to understand this. And not just the public, but enterprise consumers who don't have the kind of time. And I think this is sort of a significant part of answering what you're getting at. It may seem like a tangent. If you don't have a suite of sustainability personnel, or you don't have, you know, Google or Microsoft have multiple people working on sustainability in real estate. But once you drop down a couple of tiers from a company that size, you've got maybe one person working on sustainability. And somehow we've got to get those people exposed to this community too. So that for me, I think is the key challenge that I want to think about. The sort of focused community challenge for mass is, how do we make sure if you don't have a lot of time or resources, you can still understand the possibilities and potential of mass timber? Woodworks and other folks, you know, Ian's work from yesterday, they're going to take care of the technical side of that. But we also need to reach these people, you know, beyond just on the technical side of things, and make sure that we're creating essentially the air cover for them to use this technology, so that we don't hear from a school principal, you know, I didn't want to do mass timber because I was worried it was going to be controversial, which is a sort of terrifying piece of feedback.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, I am very focused on the technical, and just keeping up with that is more than enough to try to keep up. While others do, like you're doing the heavy lifting on the climate side of the story. Even looking at it here from Oregon, we can't possibly keep up with the pace of technology change and best practices and tools. It's evolving quickly. And this market's so big just to keep up with what's going on here, as you said, on the US West Coast. But here are a couple other questions I think are from a couple of our participants. Alexandra Apolinarska, what is your favorite strategy to keep the CO2 stored in mass timber beyond the life of the original building?
Yeah, that's beyond my technical pay grade to try and answer that question. I'm most excited to connect people to people who can answer that question, but I wouldn't be able to approach that one. I'm pretty sure someone on your seminar series will, so sorry not to be able to answer that directly.
And here's another question from Frank Weeks. What is the elevator pitch you would give about forest management to convince people it is doable in a minimally impactful way?
Yeah, that's something you learn at Forest Proud. I'll give myself a couple of seconds to come up with your elevator pitch, but that's something you learn to be extremely careful with. So let me just start. I'll come to the elevator pitch itself, but let me start by addressing something that I think is key in that. Anyone who's worked in the forest sector for any length of time will be extremely careful in how they answer that question, right? And it is a difficult question to answer without inviting all sorts of complexities and issues into it. But the bottom line for me is, if you manage forests well and you're using a sustainable resource, that has to be better than digging things out of the ground that we can't replace. I mean, it's almost as simple as that. That as long as we are managing forests sustainably, building buildings, rebuilding cities and infrastructure out of wood is going to be the best option we have as a species. Then, you know, that's the quickest version I can give you. And then, of course, there are all sorts of details, and what does sustainable mean, and where are you sourcing wood from, and all of that. And we're all knee deep or neck deep in trying to understand those questions. And I think we have a lot of questions still to answer about carbon and climate change and mass timber. Don't get me wrong. I think those questions remain, and we should be transparent. We should work on them. We've got a lot of questions still to answer. But for me, it's as simple as that. using wood. Wood is the most extraordinary thing we have to use to reimagine, rebuild our cities, and we should be using wood to do that. And then beneath that elevator pitch, let's make sure we answer those questions and address them well. Doing that at scale is going to provide the biggest lever we've ever had globally to manage forests sustainably. There's no bigger lever that's ever been brought to bear on the prospect of how we manage forests than what's happening right now in those companies. That was not a one-sentence elevator pitch, but I hope you got the basis. For me is use wood. It's got to be better than the alternative. That's my 5-word elevator pitch.
Great. Thanks for doing that on the fly like that. Another question from Sean Wood. Any thoughts on how local governments can help promote, facilitate?
Just making sure I've got a power situation. Hold on, guys. Say that one more time, Greg.
Any thoughts on how local governments can help promote and facilitate?
Well, I mean, the really cool thing is, and I don't know, is Tracy Johns going to be speaking on any of these?
No, she's not.
I mean, it'd be great if she was on the call and could answer this right away. What we're seeing now is local governments in the states and cities, state administrations too, start to think regionally about mass timber. I think we've got the same job to do with them that we have with everybody else, which is make sure that they're fully educated in the potential of mass timber and that they're getting exposed to these technologies. But now we're seeing that all over the world. The announcements in France, work people are trying to do in developing countries too. So I think it's an education process for regional governments, but we're certainly starting to see that energy be brought to bear on this. And I think when you can start to think of those kind of scales, whether it's at the city scale or a regional scale, again, it's a great opportunity to get the public behind these projects too.
Another question from Matthew Chiles. To piggyback on the forest management question, how would you address the perception of emerging markets over harvesting natural resources? I think of Brazil and the negative perception the public has on deforestation and disruption of ecosystems in the Amazon.
Yeah, I think, we need to be, it's a complicated situation because we're sourcing from different countries, we're shipping the products to other countries. We've got, all these different dynamics in terms of where things are sourced from. Are they being sourced sustainably? Some forests are being managed sustainably, some aren't. What's interesting in the public eye, I think globally, is that people don't necessarily make those distinctions, right? So what we know from Forest Proud, we really dug into this in the States, is that the public conflates forest management globally. They don't distinguish between this is how a forest is being managed in the States, this is how it's being managed in Brazil. So I think overall, the challenge we have to meet is that people are pretty convinced that if you're using trees, it's probably a bad thing. So to me, it starts with a fundamental change in the narrative, which is there are good ways to use these products and that mass timber is a positive and a solution. The word everyone's going to use is education. Education is not our issue. We've been trying to educate the public about how we use forests or who's employed in the forest sector for years and years and years. Educating is, got a 12-week-old puppy who's starting to get in on this call. Educating isn't going to take care of it. We actually have to reframe the perception and start at that level. So I would say, to answer your question in the simplest possible terms, is we need to focus on fundamentally reframing how people look at this technology and then being transparent and clear about what sustainable forestry management means. Those two things have to happen together. But the days of just repeating over and over, we're doing this sustainably, aren't working. Can't keep sort of polishing the story on sustainable management. We need to engage with the public in a credible, candid way and be transparent about what these technologies mean. But I think it's just like any other topic where you're trying to change public opinion. It's not about statistics and facts. It's about reframing their understanding of what it is that we're doing. I look forward to 2030 to 2050 with great excitement, because I think by the time we get there as a mass timber community, once we get to 2030, 2050, it's going to be a completely different conversation in the public eye about what forest management means, what building out of wood means. I think we're going to get there. The big question is, can we get there quickly enough?
And here's a question from Lloyd Alter, who's been writing about mass timber as a major advocate for many, many years, as well as prefab and architecture. His question is, the masonry and concrete and steel industries have money. The European CLT and wood companies have tons of money, and you can't even sell a wood school in Oregon? Why is the state so backwards on this?
I'd really, as someone who's been struggling to raise money on communicating about forests for 4 years, I would love to spend another 90 minutes trying to answer that question. It's an excellent question, why that money isn't there. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to 50 years of a very unfortunate dynamic where the sector was, you've only got to go back and say the phrase spotted owl, and you'll see the immediate reaction of everybody in the States, right? And what that meant was the best option seemed to be not to talk about what we were doing, essentially, and not spend money and invest time in communications efforts. Somebody put it once as, there's not much point in trying to convince the public that we're the white hats. That was the expression I heard used once about the sector. Now, unfortunately, what that means is you leave a vacuum. And I'm sure, your colleague who asked the question knows that that's exactly what does happen. If you don't invest in creating a frame and an understanding in the public mind about these issues, leaving a vacuum means that vacuum will always get filled in people's minds. And as we all know, unfortunately, there's almost nothing harder than the visual story of cutting down trees to overcome. That's a tough one, for people driving past a clear cut or people thinking about seeing trees cut down. It's a hard one to overcome. But all I can tell you is, I think now's the time, because I think the mass timber story works. We've proven that on social media. We can actually show you the sentiment analysis of sharing these mass timber stories. They do help get the public over the hump of using wood. And then I think the other thing is, which, and I appreciate the question, because I think maybe you're trying to help me out by asking that question. I don't think this is going to sound counterintuitive. I don't think the sector is going to pay to tell the story, not the forest sector itself. I think big tech and big enterprise companies who really understand the brand risk that they face are the people that are going to invest in telling that story. That's where we need to source the money to do this right. Because if you're, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, you've experienced what happens when you don't look after a narrative like this. And they're going to have to look after it as they scale up their use of the technology.
Right. Another question. You mentioned we need young leaders. We need to act globally, and we need open source solutions. In a time where few players dominate the means of production to act globally, and considering the open source approach that you suggested, how to prevent an outcome where young people would end up developing free solutions to big enterprises, making the market even more concentrated?
Not sure I quite understand. Help me with the question there, Greg. I can get the gist of it.
I think there's a consolidation of the means of production of manufacturing globally, or you could even argue technology companies, bigger companies growing bigger. If you're trying to advocate for open solutions and community, how do you promote that, and even open source that isn't only benefiting the biggest companies that are already the biggest? Right.
Yeah. Well, I may be a bit of an idealist on this one. Listening to some of those companies, so I've been having initial conversations with some of those folks at some of the largest companies globally to understand. I mean, they have a sense of responsibility too. They are recognizing that they have the resources to, do experiments, show up at all of these conferences, sort of be on the learning curve of mass timber. But I think most of them are starting to try and say, how do we make sure that what we're learning can be shared globally in an open source way too? So I guess, I don't know if I'm being an idealist or that I have such a strong sense of time with all of this. I think people are convinced, and I think, you know, we've just experienced a pandemic. My kids experienced being inside for weeks during wildfires this summer. I think everybody recognizes that we've got to address climate change as fast as we possibly can. And to me, that means there's going to be an open source element to do that. How that plays out in terms of markets, that's again sort of outside of my wheelhouse. But personally, my take is, as mass timber accelerates as a technology, as this adoption curve continues, we need to do everything we can to make it as easy as possible for you know, every scale of enterprise to use this technology. So not sure I'm answering your question very well, but I do think open source has to play a part in that. If we're actually going to, you know, and to me it is, how far can we get in 10 years and how far are we going to get in 20 years with this technology? We have to accelerate adoption if it's actually going to impact climate change. That's going to mean making some sacrifices that we wouldn't make under normal adoption of a technology. But I think we're all in that together. You know, I don't want to get biblical about it because I think that's a tricky thing to use those kind of metaphors. But you know, there's a reason there's a story about building an ark. I see the mass timber community as the people building the ark to take care of climate change as a challenge. You know, we are the folks that have the technology, that have built a community around something that can have such an enormous impact on climate change. And it's up to every single one of us to do our part to do that. And that will mean making some sacrifices. But my sense is the faster we can get the technology out there and get everybody using it, the better we're going to do.
Here's a question from Lech Muzinski, who will be presenting later on mass timber supply chain. Lech asks, how do you think including a focus on the utilization of fiber-generated fire prevention, forest restoration projects and schemes for reuse and recycling of mass timber panel elements may help in winning minds and hearts of the public?
Yeah, no, and I've talked to, it's good to hear from Lech. Hey, Lech, I talked to Lech a little bit about this before. I think that is a missing, you know, it doesn't seem to be, and Greg, you and I have talked about this too, the fabrication side of this too. I think for the public, and when you're telling stories about this technology, the more comprehensive the story is, and you know, the better. Like the public wants to know what's going to happen in terms of deconstruction. The public wants to know where the waste goes. We tend to get very focused on just some aspects of production, but I think in telling the story of the technology, you know, doing that kind of cradle to grave piece of saying, look at all the different ways that this technology is more sustainable than typical forms of construction is great. So we've got to get that piece in there. And I think the other thing to Lech's point, which is really important, talking to this community, is standardization is so critical to making these products cost effective, and it's happening very quickly. And I think that's a point that folks are kind of missing in the community a bit from the carbon climate change side of the community, that we only have a few years while these products get standardized to make sure that they're optimized for things like deconstruction. So I think, you know, time is of the essence in that regard too. It's the next few years while things get standardized, while these products get standardized, that we need to build in that kind of thinking. I think you might have muted, Greg, or I can't hear you.
Sorry. Here's a question from Ken Matsui. Do you foresee the building code or local jurisdiction requiring embodied carbon accountability in buildings similar to energy performance targets?
Yeah, again, that's beyond this communicator of mass timber benefits. Is sort of outside of my wheelhouse. But I mean, I think what's going to happen with code, you know, the thing I'm excited about with code is now that we've created, you know, now that so much work has been done on code in specific countries, how do we make sure that that code gets shared globally, or the insights from doing that get shared globally? But embodied carbon and how that's going to play out in code, I don't have an answer to that.
Here's a question from Shamnat Tajuddin. He says, what do you think about the development activities on tall timber buildings from Nordic countries?
That's a question I'd ask Greg Howes. That's the question where I jump on the phone with Greg. So Greg, why don't you have a crack at that one?
Yeah, I'll do that. Actually, we've had 7 events in the Nordic countries, 5 in Finland and 2 in Helsinki, actually 1 in Norway. And there's ongoing discussions with the Nordic Tall Timber, I think that's the name, Council, and the Build and Wood organization, which is led a lot by in Denmark. And we're under discussion, how do we have a similar event in the Nordic countries this fall, potentially in October, because there would be many benefits in connecting the North American community and the Nordic countries, because the Nordic countries have a long tradition of building in wood and also in prefab. But how do we get best practices, great design, sustainability? How do we even improve the quality of our cities? And how do we get that information to flow back and forth? And we think we would, then those best practices would travel more quickly, and it would create opportunities for innovators and startups. Because when I'm talking, I'll give another example, Estonia, with not even 2 million people, they have over 150 prefab companies. But what they're doing is largely unknown in the US market, and they're serving small markets. If you're the 5 million people in Denmark, it's a very small market. You may have a great solution or great design, and they're even doing a wood community in Copenhagen, Henning Larsen. But that information does not travel to the US.
Right.
So I think that kind of exchange would be really beneficial.
Yeah, just to jump in on that for a second. I mean, I was looking at if you just look at affordable housing projects around the world right now, using mass timber to address affordable housing as an issue, there's numerous different initiatives and numerous different foundations investing in affordable housing projects right now. And when you think about that globally and how limited the resources are to take care of that, and then you look at the fact that Google's investing $1 billion in affordable housing in California, I'm like, we should be sharing, that's an area where we should be sharing the solutions globally, right? There's no, I don't think anybody would argue against having open source solutions to the affordable housing crisis that we face globally. So I think there are numerous examples where the opportunities of sharing in that way globally seem, far outweigh the downsides of it. The other thing I would say, just in terms of the communication side of it, which is sort of the part we've perhaps talked about most with mass, with limited resources available to do communications on this, we should be shooting content globally, right? We should be creating a series that, if we're going to create a streaming series about reimagining cities, that should be a global product that can be used in multiple different countries. Because we're, in a sense, we're only going to have one go at raising the funds to go and do that. So I would want to be sure that the kind of content we create going forwards has application globally.
Right, and I want to remind people that Peter Finholm from Denmark, who's also one of the leaders in the Build and Wood EU 2020 project focused on timber, will be one of our speakers. So we're trying to coordinate that and figure out how to create those relationships.
Yeah.
Here's another question, Adam Silvers. How soon can we see supply chain specific, AKA product specified EPDs to better demonstrate forest carbon variations by forest stand owner and certification? Is this a specific lack of investment? How is that solved? I mostly understand that, not completely, but.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it. I don't know if I'm answering his question, but I think I can get on the direction of it. That conversation is accelerating very quickly, right? So sourcing and certification as topics, specifically the sourcing and certification of mass timber is really heating up now as a discussion. And I think what's interesting is making sure that you're really going to see a menu of possibilities in terms of how you source these products, and that can be tiered from this product was sourced, locally, and we know the exact story behind the stand where this was cut, and we have an incredibly sort of detailed, rich story behind where that was sourced, all the way down to, yeah, this is certified, we can tick some boxes on it, and then it's a sustainable product. That we as a sector tend to get very, as a community, get very, very sort of stuck in our positions around sourcing and certification. And I think that's a real challenge for us going forward. And I'd say it's a real challenge in a couple of different ways. It has the potential as a discussion to actually slow down adoption. If we get so stuck in how we're thinking about or how we're talking about sourcing and certification, I think a couple of things will happen. We won't move as fast as the adoption curve might. And we're also going to confuse end consumers and enterprise companies and make them shy away from controversy. So there's no easy solution to resolving the sourcing and certification questions. We know that we have to take care of making sure we're sourcing from sustainably managed forests. But my real fear is if we can't find a sort of logical path through those arguments, we're actually going to end up making consumers shy away from using these products in the first place. So I don't think his question was more technical, but I think on a broader level, I think what is critical in this community right now is, and we've got folks at World Wildlife Fund and Google trying to sort of take on this challenge right now. We have to make sure over the next couple of years that we find a path through the sourcing and certification questions that don't make people shy away from using these products. Or again, we're missing out on that 2030 timeframe.
We'll take a few more because we're at the top of the hour, but it's great to see such active discussion. And that's why this should be preserved online, and in many ways it will be, because we'll share this video. Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. I agree that wood is a great material to save the world, and it will replace other building materials. However, I'm curious about the comparison between huge concrete buildings such as the Empire State Building built in 1929 and tall wood buildings. If we consider carbon savings, the carbon emissions per year of the Empire State Building is the total emitted carbon when it was built divided by the now 1929. If we consider this aspect, does a tall wood building still have an advantage? Is there any examples of tall wood buildings that have been standing for a long time?
Depends how you define tall wood building, but I think it's, is it Andrew from England who puts up that slide of the temple that's been standing for 3,000 years or something? So there's definitely some very old school tall wood buildings. In terms of looking at the overall energy use and embodied carbon, I think, this is another challenge that we have as a community, and I'm not equipped to speak to the technical side of it. But what I can say is listening to folks talk about LCAs, about embodied carbon, all the different ways that we think these buildings, there's a lot of questions to still be resolved, and a lot of really smart people working on those questions. I come back to the fundamental for me, which is, as long as we're sourcing from sustainably managed forests, using wood to build these buildings intuitively, to me, has to be more positive than using traditional construction materials. Yes, we've got questions to resolve, and yes, that research needs to be done. And I think, the right people are racing to answer those questions. But I don't think that's a reason to shy away from adopting the technology. I think we need to, build the plane as we fly on that one. Greg, you look like you might have something to add to that. I know a lot of people on this call would be able to answer that question brilliantly, so I'm sorry I can only give a...
There are many buildings, wooden buildings, that have been standing for a very, very long time. That would be my quick answer on that. I'm going to ask one more question, Will, because we have another presentation at 10:30. And then I want you to tell people how to stay in touch with Mass and Will Novy-Hildesley. But let's answer this one last question. What are the challenges in the supply chain of timber products when they're shipped from Canada or Europe?
Say that one more time, see if I can have anything to add to that. That sounds like another Greg question. Yeah,
what are the challenges in the supply chain of timber products when they're shipped from Canada or Europe?
Right, yeah, no, and I think that's another question that can be counterintuitive, right? We've seen people model the carbon impacts of actually importing products versus using local ones. And it's another it depends question. It's not as simple as we might think to map the impact of, obviously in an ideal world, we're getting to use local products. We're getting to use some of the wood that we haven't been able to use in terms of residuals and things in mass timber. I think we'll get there, but right now, with limited production, we're not quite there yet. How are we doing on time, Greg? You need me to.
Yeah. Can I just have you tell people how to stay in touch with you and keep track of mass?
Yeah, please. We are literally constructing our site, and the community. We'll be demonstrating the community that we're building. You can contact me at will@mass-carbon.org. And I'll also do a dangerous thing and throw out my telephone number, because I think it's a pretty limited community, but it's 503-348-9373. And then the site will be www.mass-carbon.org once that's up.
Any idea on how long before that's up?
Depends on a meeting I have today, but it's going to be up by the time of the big conference at the end of the month here in the States. So we'll be up soon.